All right, let's go ahead and get started. I am Lisel Hintz. I'm an assistant professor here at SAIS in the European and Eurasian Studies program. It is my distinct pleasure to host this panel on Turkey tensions with the West, with a really outstanding group of scholars and practitioners and analysts here. This is the second installment of our Calleo speaker series that I'm curating this term. So we're really excited to be able to focus on Turkey. I sort of hijacked the agenda and said, this is what we're going to talk about. So as I said, I'm really excited to have these actually friends and colleagues and superb analysts here. All the way down at the end, we have Alan Makovsky, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, many years at the State Department with a lot of experience at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, so brings a lot of expertise to the field. Next to him, we have Gönül. Dr. Gönül is the founder of the Center for Turkish Studies at the Middle East Institute. She's also an adjunct professor at George Washington University and a frequent commentator on Mediascope, which I think is one of the sort of best Turkish news outlets out there. Then we have, of course, Ambassador Eric Edelman, who is a career foreign service officer. He is former ambassador to Turkey, so brings an immense amount of experience to the field here. And of course, is one of our distinguished faculty members here at SAIS and teaches a course on diplomatic disasters. So I think that might be sort of relevant to some of the things we're going to be talking about today. And then right next to me, I have Dr. Sinan Ciddi, who is the executive director of the Institute of Turkish Studies at Georgetown. He's also a visiting associate professor there, and he is a frequent writer for Stratfor. So we've got immense academic, policy, research, State Department experience, so I'm really excited to have all of these colleagues here. So we're going to be focusing on Turkey's tensions with the West. I'm biased. I wrote a book on it, so we're going to be bringing domestic politics into the foreign policy discussion that we're talking about, kind of seeing what's going on with Turkey, with the opposition, what President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is doing. So it's going to be a multifaceted discussion. I wanted to sort of kick it off with a discussion about Russia. I think when we're thinking about the tensions between the U.S. and Turkey, not just the U.S., of course, NATO countries deeply embedded, involved in this discussion, specifically over the purchase of an S-400 missile defense system from Russia, which we don't normally think of as appropriate behavior for NATO countries. So this is one of these big contentious points between U.S. and Turkey now. So I'll start with Dr. Ciddi. So how do we get here, right? So over the summer in the policy discussions that I was in, you know, a lot of the questions were about, is Turkey actually going to go ahead with this purchase, right? We've seen Turkey kind of make similar claims in the past, purchase a system from China. Was this just kind of rhetorical posturing? And now, you know, clearly there's been, you know, progress made on this. And there was a distinct effort on the U.S. government's part to try to deter this. And there was a lot of discussion this summer about potential sanctions. So what went wrong? Did the U.S. government have any real leverage over Turkey in this? Was there something that could have been done? How can we think about Turkey's behavior in choosing this path?
Thank you, Dr. Hintz, for inviting me, and probably the least qualified person on this panel to speak about this, but I'm sure my colleagues can weigh in more substantive ways. What went wrong? I mean, if we had to, if this was an Excel filter, we'd probably go on to what went right, just to sort of isolate, you know, the actual. The one thing I could kick it off and then defer to my colleagues and friends here would be to suggest that Turkey has ultimately gone ahead, and I didn't necessarily think they would follow through with this by this time, by opting to buy what I would refer to as a tactical weapon over a strategic priority, which was the F-35s. And what I mean by that is that op-ed that came out in the Washington Post over late spring, early summer, I think, the bipartisan op-ed that suggested that Turkey can have either the F-35 or the S-400, but it cannot have both, seems to sort of encapsulate the whole notion. And many people, including myself up until a point, just assumed that this was just a bargaining chip to leverage and exact much more out of the United States in terms of Erdogan's asks, and then finally that the wind would blow over, and that essentially that he would just basically, you know, go back into the fold. And the precedent for that was Turkey did the same thing with the Chinese missile defense system back in 2010. Now, that hasn't happened, and the components and various parts of the S-400 missile batteries and defense system is starting to be delivered, parcel by parcel into Ankara, as we've seen. There is the notion of sanctions being imposed, and the administration seems to be toying with that. I'd be interested to know what Ambassador Edelman knows that you could share with us, possibly. Whether we've heard in the news over the last few days that the administration is looking at this. But then there was also a notion that Erdogan recently stated that Turkey might actually take another look at buying the Patriot systems. Again, it just doesn't make a whole load of sense to me from a multiple perspectives, whether it's strategic, alliance relations, when Turkey essentially does have major rifts with Russia. I think Gönül might be able to say a lot more about that. Then what does essentially Erdogan have to fall back on, because he is now buying a weapon system that is going to cause him more trouble than possibly benefits? But I'll stop there.
Excellent, thank you. Ambassador Edelman, I do want to pick up on this. Is this a diplomatic disaster? I mean, if you think
Yes.
about, short answer, right? We like that. If I think about deterrent strategy and the efforts that we normally think of, I don't see them in play. So is this a diplomatic disaster? Could the U.S. have prevented this, or was there nothing that it could have done and Turkey was gung-ho?
So, yes, this is a diplomatic disaster. I think we're watching a slow motion train wreck in terms of U.S.-Turkish relations. I mean, the only thing that surprises me about this is we haven't, had the real blow up yet. Some of that is because I think the Turkish government and certainly the president of Turkey have invested an enormous amount in the Trump-Erdogan relationship and still believe that relationship will save them from the sanctions that are called for under CATSA. I mean, there are two different elements here. One is the F-35 incompatibility with the S-400, which has already resulted in Turkey being excluded from the F-35 program. That is a huge deal. Turkey was a original participant in the international cooperative program that is F-35. There were 900 different parts to the F-35 being manufactured in Turkey as part of co-production arrangements. 400 of them are unique elements to the F-35. So it's just a very, very big deal. And it took a lot for the Department of Defense to get itself to the point of saying that it was going to kick Turkey out of the F-35 program. It wasn't done lightly. But there's an additional element here, which is because Rosaboronexport, which is the Russian institution that actually facilitated the sale of the S-400, is a sanctioned entity under the CATSA Act, and therefore it triggers CATSA sanctions. There is no, Alan is the expert on this, and so he'll correct me if I get any of this wrong on the congressional side. As I understand it, there's no timeline, so the president is not obliged by any particular point on the date on the calendar.
That's certainly how I read it.
To impose the sanctions. And he's clearly asked, because of his conversations with Erdogan, has clearly asked for the Congress for more time. He convened a group of 45 Republican senators, I think it was late July or early August, before they went out on just before they went out on recess, and said, I need more time to work this with Erdogan. And he's promised, I mean, there are two things that are in play, I think. One is an effort to negotiate some kind of free trade agreement with Turkey, and he dispatched Secretary Wilbur Ross, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, to Turkey for a 5-6 day visit, where they're going to boost the bilateral trade from $20 billion a year between the two countries to $100 billion a year. Good luck with that. I mean, I broke my pick on that myself as ambassador. It's a lot easier to say you're going to do it than to do it. And the other piece of it is he's asked Lindsey Graham to work with both the defense and foreign ministers to come up with some variant of a deal that was worked back in the late 90s with Greece, when Greece bought the Cyprus bought the S-300, which ended up having them stay in their crates and relocated to Crete, I think it was. So the idea would be somehow the Turks don't have to back away from the S-400 deal with Russia and embarrass themselves that way. but it also opens the door, as Sinan was saying, to potentially buying Patriot.
Exactly.
Now, on the question of whether the U.S. or Turkey bears most of the blame here, I mean, my own view is Turkey bears most of the blame. There's a kind of litany of complaints that Erdogan and the Turks have about the U.S. not being willing to sell Patriot to Turkey. I mean, I won't go into all the ins and outs and details, but I commend to everybody a very good article in War on the Rocks by Jim Townsend and Rachel Ellahus, my former colleagues in the Department of Defense, who go chapter and verse on the history of that and why, in the end of the day, that's not a fair criticism of the United States.
Excellent. So just to actually follow up a little bit, since you came into your position as ambassador in a pretty tense time in U.S.-Turkey relations, it was right after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and Turkey had denied use of Incirlik Air Base while the ruling AKP was kind of promising that they were going to get that passed. In terms of context, is this the tensest you've seen U.S.-Turkish relations? Is this 1974? Like, where are we?
No, I think this is actually, I would say this is worse certainly than when I was there in the 03-05 period. I think it's worse. I mean, again, Alan and Gönül will know better the history of this, but I would say it's worse than the Johnson letter in 1967, and it's worse than 74.
Wow.
I think this is the worst point in U.S.-Turkish relations that I can think of.
Okay. Wow. And I think, obviously Turkey's sort of move towards Russia seems to be a big part of this. Gönül, can you talk a little bit about, is this indicative of a warming of relations with Russia? A lot of it's being discussed in the news that, Turkey or the U.S. has lost Turkey, which is a phrase I don't like because it, denies agency to a country when you say it got lost by something. But how can we sort of interpret Turkey's moves towards Russia right now? Is it purely about the S-400s? What role is Syria playing in this? You've written a lot on this, so I'm interested in your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, before that, I just want to say something on what just Ambassador Edelman said, which is this is the worst crisis that the two countries has faced. And I think if you look at the history of relations, there were certainly many ups and downs, but the difference then was starting from 1960s, then the Johnson letter, then 1974, the arms embargo, and the Hood incident. Something was quite different in the sense that there was always a center-right party that was willing to mend ties, and the Turkish military. So it was, for instance, in the latest serious crisis which happened in after the invasion of Iraq, the Turkish military stepped in. So they were the ones that really wanted to mend ties. And now, if we look at both sides of the Atlantic, there is not really a constituency who would push for a better partnership. I think many people here, including I think the defense establishment here, given up on Turkey as a partner. And in Turkey too, I mean, we have obviously the AKP. When it came to power, it was one of the most pro-US, pro-West actors in Turkish politics at the time. And that's long gone, and the Turkish military too. I mean, nowadays, if you are, if you're seen as a pro-NATO person, that's really that could be troubling for your future career in the Turkish military. So that's where we are at the moment, and that's why I think there's something structural going on that really makes things difficult for both parties to mend the partnership. And on your question about Turkey's relationship with Russia, well, I think this whole partnership, Turkey-Russia partnership, started as a modest trade partnership in the 1980s. And now it has evolved into a defense partnership among others, the energy partnership and trade partnership. And if you look at the history of Turkey-US relations, you'll see that the West always played an important role in the sense that one of the main drivers of this rapprochement between the two countries has always been these two countries' troubled relationship with the West. Russia historically has considered itself as part of the West. I mean, after the Cold War, even Putin himself, I mean, he pushed for initially when he came to power at the turn of the century, he pushed for closer ties with the European Union. And before, throughout the 1990s, Russia tried everything to become part of every Western institution. And West was not really interested in that. So similarly with Turkey, I think Turkey obviously has this very troubled relationship, with this love-hate relationship with the Western world. So whenever there was a problem with Russian relationship with the West and Turkish relationship with the West, these two countries somehow found each other as a plan B in a sense. So I think this relationship with the West is one of the main drivers of what we are seeing today in Turkey-Russia relationship. So the bad news is that there are so many problems in Turkey-US relations and Turkey-EU relations that this relationship between Turkey and Russia will only get stronger. And that doesn't mean that it's not fragile in a lot of sense, because it is. I mean, there are serious policy differences starting from Syria, from Libya, from Eastern Mediterranean, in the Balkans, in the Caucasus. So there's a lot of tension too. So I'm not saying that this is a strong strategic partnership. I'm saying that it could evolve into a strategic partnership. Yes, I agree with you. The purchase of S-400 is a huge deal. And imagine if Turkey moves forward with the Russian fighter jets. What if Erdogan decides to purchase Russian fighter jets? This is a major change in the Turkish defense sector, because that could actually lead to a structural change, because we're talking about a military that has worked with the Western security establishment since the 1950s. They were trained by U.S. military, with U.S. military hardware. So if Turkey makes that decision, it's going to change both the entire culture in Turkish military and certainly lead to a structural change. So it could, Turkey-Russia partnership is at the moment, it's very fragile, but I think depending on the next steps, particularly by the U.S., if we see a round of CATSA sanctions that weakens Turkey's defense industry further, I think Erdogan will just simply choose to work with Russia. And that's not, I understand the anti-Turkey sentiment here, and I understand where the Congress stands, and I agree with where they stand. But on the other hand, you have to be strategic about this. So I think applying CATSA sanctions is a huge deal, and it will further push Turkey towards Russia.
Excellent, thank you. Alan Makovsky, kind of picking up on this, you've got your finger on the pulse. Where are we looking in terms of CATSA sanctions? As Gönül mentioned, you sort of have a Congress that's united in its anti-Turkey sentiment in this time. We saw a lot of publications in major newspapers over the summer. What do you expect? What do you think is going to come out of this? And what role is Trump playing in terms of maybe preserving the relationship with Erdogan, and how might that affect this?
Well, first of all, thank you, Madam Chairman, for inviting me to this distinguished
Absolute pleasure.
panel. This amazing group of Turkey experts. And also, I do want to say, I think you've been here at SAIS now for a couple of years. You've really added a very new dimension, I think, to Turkey analysis in this city because of your understanding of Turkish culture and Turkish identity issues, and I have found it very interesting. I'm not just saying that to praise you, but I've been in this city for, anyone want to guess how long? Yeah. Longer than some of the people on the panel have been alive. So
I'd like to think that.
Anyway,
Thank you,
not
Alan.
everybody. Of course, I meant you, Eric. Now, turning to CATSA sanctions, so first of all, does everyone know what CATSA is? No. So let me just quickly say CATSA stands for Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. It was a bill passed by Congress 2 years ago, I think in large part in response to concerns about Trump's relationship with Russia, particularly after he met privately with Putin without any note takers. And the idea of it is to deter countries from allying with Russia. Now, the S-400 issue was already at play, and some people on the Hill say Turkey was prominently in their minds when they passed it. The relevant part for Turkey is that it says there should be sanctions, economic sanctions against countries that do a significant transaction, in fact, buy something important, from the defense or intelligence sectors of the Russian Federation. It says sanctions should, now what are the sanctions? There's a menu of 12 sanctions from which the president is supposed to choose at least 5. It's a variety of, some are very tough, some are almost economy breaking, and some are milder and can be applied just to individuals. According to the legislation, it's supposed to begin when a country takes delivery of something of defense equipment, in effect, or intelligence equipment that it buys from Russia. Now, as Ambassador Edelman said, I think there are some holes in it. And I'm not really expecting President Trump to pursue sanctions, so you can relax. There's the word. No, it's not 100%, but that's certainly my sense. Now, it's kind of interesting. My friends in Congress, people in Congress who I spoke to about this, when the legislation was passed, said it's airtight. The president can't get around imposing sanctions. But it seems to me, from my reading of it and, quizzing some of my former colleagues on the Hill, I worked in Congress for 13 years. I see at least 3 holes. One is, the biggest one is what you said, Eric, that there's really nothing in the legislation that says now the president must confirm to Congress that this transaction has taken place. So there's nothing that kicks off the timeline. And there are ways to do that in legislation. I've worked on a lot of sanctions legislation in my life, and I'm not the one who came up with these clever ideas, but I've seen ways of doing that written into legislation. Second of all, there's a provision that says if the president declares a country sanctionable, he can waive implementation. And there is a third factor, and this is the one where I think people who passed the legislations had made it airtight, that if Congress is not happy with the sanctions the president imposed, finds them too light, or is just unhappy with his decision about waiving implementation, they can pass a resolution of disapproval. But the problem is they would have to pass it, both House and Senate agreed language, within 30 days. That's very, very hard to do. That's almost never done. And I think that it would be, I think it's more than likely that if the president went to his friends in the Senate, to his Republican friends, not all of them, some of whom feel very strongly in the other direction, and said, look, we don't want to drive Turkey deeper into Russia's lap. If we do these sanctions, just like Gönül said, it's going to be a disaster, and it's going to have the adverse effect. It's going to have the reverse effect. Rather than preventing Turkey from going towards Russia, it will it will cause it will cause Turkey to become closer with Russia. So, look, Trump and Erdogan seem to have a close relationship. Trump often seems to be the only one in the executive branch who likes Erdogan. There have been some exceptions. At times they've had their quarrels, but basically, I don't think Trump wants to sanction him. The issue of sanctions has come up before, and by the way, it's still in play on the issue of a bank in Turkey called Halkbank, a state-owned bank that is deeply implicated in circumvention of Iran sanctions, not the current round, from the previous round under President Obama. We've been waiting for a long time for Treasury to make an announcement about sanctions, and so far it hasn't happened. So that's another area where it seems that the president may have decided that he doesn't want to go in the direction of sanctions. So I'm personally not expecting it. There are some people who say, look, for the integrity of CATSA, you have to do sanctions. And I mean, if the president feels he has to do sanctions, I don't think he'll feel this way, but if he does, perhaps he could focus on individuals such as the defense minister or the chief of staff. Also, if I could, just very quickly just add, I hope that explanation wasn't too detailed, but did people follow it, basically? Yeah, okay.
Very clear and much needed. Thank you.
Look, I did just want to, I agree with everything that Sinan and Eric and Gönül have said about the severity of the current crisis. I would just say, as actually being old enough to remember the arms embargo, I was already close to retirement at that time. Not really. No, I wasn't really in Washington yet at that time. But I do remember I was in Turkey, believe it or not, during part of that time. One of the big differences, that was a very serious crisis. And being in Turkey, I really felt it on a very personal level. But there was always a sense, I think in the U.S., that Turkey really had no place else to go. That the U.S. and Turkey, you know, they were in a crisis. They had to work their way through it. But Turkey wasn't going to jump ship and go over to the Soviet bloc. And now, for the first time, you know, people are afraid that Turkey really sees itself as having options. I think it would be a poor choice from the standpoint of Turkish interests, but it's obviously a choice that Erdogan wants us to think he's considering.
Excellent. Gönül, you want to pick up?
On Alan's point, he said that he doesn't think that President Trump is interested in implementing CATSA sanctions. I agree with you, except if Erdogan has been threatening a unilateral military action into northeastern Syria. In fact, just yesterday he said that he is going to meet with President Trump on the sidelines of UN General Assembly meetings, and there he will push for a safe zone in northern Syria. And if that doesn't work out, he's gonna do it unilaterally. I don't know if he's serious or not, but if he is, this is a very risky decision. And I don't think it is wise on his part. Yeah. Because for a long time, President Trump has been the only person in Washington who stood by Erdogan. And if he does something like that, and either by mistake, if he kills an American soldier, forget about that. And President Trump can, so the CATSA sanctions are still on the table. And if he says that if he actually moves forward with the unilateral military action, which he says might happen by the end of this month, in that case, I think Trump might be more than willing to implement.
Yeah, look, what I was talking about with the status quo, I am 1,000,000% agree with what Gönül said. And I think one other possibility, Erdogan was recently in Moscow, and he was with Putin looking at the Sukhoi 35 and 57, I guess they talked about as well, the Russian stealth fighter. And he said, are these for sale? And Putin smiled and said, you can buy them now. Yeah,
cash on the
which
barrel
is not really true.
Which may not be true, but
Photo op, though.
Were he to make a decision to buy Russian aircraft, Russian military aircraft, then all bets are off. Then absolutely, I think that would be the end, and you would see Congress, if necessary, pass new legislation to sanction Turkey.
Good. Go ahead.
Just a couple of points. I mean, I certainly agree with Alan that I think the president's given every signal imaginable that he does not want to impose these sanctions. And as I said, I think he's made an effort to buy some time with Republicans, interestingly not Democrats. He hasn't talked to Democrats about it at all. But the problem, I think, from the congressional side, I'd be interested in your view on this, Alan, is compared to when I was ambassador, 15 years ago, there is no well of sympathy in the Congress for Turkey that used to exist. When I was ambassador, there was an active Turkey caucus which had 40 or 50 members.
Maybe then it only had 40 or 50. It had just begun.
Kay Granger, who was on that, was on the appropriation side. I had a lot of help whenever I needed something from the Congress. Now there is none of that. I mean, the only thing you have on the Hill is degrees of how much people want to punish Turkey.
Right.
And even, I think Eliot Engel, during the recess, when the, I think, first shipment of S-400 equipment, radars and whatnot, arrived at Murted Air Base, was calling for imposition of sanctions by the Congress. So I think now that the Congress is back, they got a lot of other things they've got to deal with. But when they begin to focus on this, and in particular, I think people seem to have bought onto the idea that until the missiles are actually taken out of the crate, and are up and operational, this isn't really a kind of question yet. But I think at some point you might get some congressional pushback. If I could add one other thing. Gönül was talking about the factors that are driving Turkey and Russia together, and I agree with what she said. But I think when she talks about the structural factors, I think it's important to sort of unpack them. And certainly, Lisel, in keeping with your own emphasis on the domestic and internal side, one of the major structural factors is both of these guys have created these authoritarian, personalistic regimes. And that are at odds with the sort of liberal international order that the United States has traditionally been associated with until this administration came into office. And so they share kind of an interest in, sticking their thumb in Uncle Sam's eye, as it were, on that set of issues. And I think that's important to bear in mind. The other is that since September of 2015, when Russia intervened in Syria, Russia has made it clear that it is going to be the arbiter of the future of Syria, which is hugely important for Turkey, since Turkey hosts more than 3.6 million Syrian refugees on its territory and desperately wants to get them out. That's why he wants to create a safe zone in Syria, to shove all these refugees out of Turkey and back into Syria. Those two factors are, driving these two together, and the perception that we're pulling out and Russia runs the show, it's not just Tayyip Erdogan who thinks that. I mean, Bibi Netanyahu has been to Moscow way more than he's been to Washington in the last 4 years.
That's right. Syria plays a really important role. And also, just one more thing, one of the reasons why Congress might feel very strongly about punishing Turkey is it's not just Turkey. They just send a message to other U.S. allies like Qataris or Saudis or Indians who are also interested in purchasing S-400. So I think they want to make sure that, we have to do this to showcase, to signal to others that this doesn't go unpunished.
Yeah,
So
that's the argument, I think, for, if President Trump does go ahead, I think that would be the argument he's responding to, but I think it would, at least his inclination would be for it to be limited, such as to individuals. On the issue of congressional pushback, I've heard a lot of people say, and there are a lot of people say very confidently, if the president doesn't impose sanctions or if there's a loophole in this legislation, we'll pass new legislation. I think I'm sort of going beyond what I'm hearing from Congress. I mean, my experience is that Congress is also risk averse.
Right.
And if the administration comes to Congress and says, hey, the real sanction, it's not part of CATSA, but the real sanction is that they're not getting the F-35s and they're being kicked out of the F-35 production program, let's not go any further and make. I think
if he does what if he does what you said earlier, Alan, which is to impose some of the 5 of the 12 and then suspend implementation.
Right.
I don't know what
that would be another way out of it.
I don't know what Congress does then.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, because I agree with you. I think getting a resolution of disapproval in that circumstance would be extremely difficult.
Right. I want to pick up on Syria because, as Gönül said, I think this is a key part of it. Aside from the S-400s, one of the main issues that we've been talking about in terms of Turkey tensions, of course, is the U.S. arming of the Syrian Kurdish forces, the YPG, in the fight against the Islamic State. Turkey rightly sees them as organically connected to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which it considers a terrorist group. So this is seen, I think, by the Turkish government as sort of a betrayal by a NATO ally. But Syria is obviously playing a huge role right now. We had Defense Minister Hulusi Akar say today that he's not happy with U.S. efforts or U.S. moves to sort of stop its connections with the YPG and so forth. So Sinan, maybe you wanted to pick up on one of these earlier points, but I want to go to you on the Turkey-Syria question, because you've written about this for Stratfor, in terms of, does there seem a workable solution that U.S. and Turkey can find? Is Turkey perhaps looking at a real unilateral invasion, or is this just kind of Erdogan's rhetoric as usual?
I'm going to leave the specifics of Syria to colleagues who follow us much more closely. I'll make a general point about this in terms of the behavioral institutional norm of how Erdogan is approaching this, simply because it might provide a useful background. Whether this is specific to Syria or the Russian relationship or Turkey's strategic priorities and defense acquisitions and its relationship with Congress here, I think it's taken a long time for most of us who look at Turkey to realize that Turkey has changed so vastly in terms of structural arrangement and how decisions get made that we kind of forget about this on the back burner and saying, well, Turkey might come back onto an even keel. It has strategic and defense priorities in the Syrian landscape, as it does with its relationship with the Americans, as well as staying within the fold of NATO and NATO priorities. But then you look at Erdogan and the decision-making capacity and how decisions get made. And I hate making the comparison between Erdogan and Putin, because Turkey and Russia's political cultures are so vastly different. But that being said, I was really very, very much interested in picking up where the ambassador left off in terms of this cult of personality thing. But it's almost like the Russian sort of equivalent of Sistema, right? Where you see, everyone now looking up to Erdogan. What does Erdogan want? What does he decide? And if he leaves the room, or let's say if he's absent for a week, people are probably looking at each other in the power corridors of Ankara thinking, well, what's going to happen? Who's going to... And I've never seen Turkey in any sort of capacity like this. Whether it was the 1974 arms embargo, whether it was the Cyprus Johnson letter in 1964, even the Iraq war, how the debacle in the bilateral relations that resulted in. We're now at a situation whereby, the process of decision making has been captured, and I don't, for one, believe that prior to 2007, you would have had a situation where if Turkey was acquiring major strategic sort of initiatives such as the F-35, if Erdogan said, well, no, we're actually going to sort of look at other alternatives, I think he would have been sat down at the table by some very stern people in Ankara, whether it was the National Security Council in Ankara or the Chief of the General Staff, and said, no, you're not. That's not how it works. And I say that confidently because that's how Cyprus worked out for these guys. I mean, Erdogan got a pretty good speaking to in terms of how he was going to approach Europe, how he was going to approach the portfolio of Cyprus. To add to that, I would say, behind the scenes in each of these difficult times, and I've said this in many other in forums, you would have had people such as yourself or other institutional mechanisms to just say, okay, there's this huge issue. So in the case of invasion of Iraq or the Houthi incident, this is an embarrassment, this is a humiliation, this is causing tensions. Turks want to go and contain the PKK on Kurdish resurgence in northern Iraq. Okay, That's blowing up in the media, but behind the scenes, what is everyone doing to solve the problem? And I don't think there were issues with the State Department. I don't think there were issues with the Defense Department in terms of trust. That is gone. That doesn't exist anymore. And that, I think, might lend some light into the notion of, when there's little goodwill. That really is fundamental, because I haven't heard any colleague or friend speak in any institution on the American side who says, yeah, we still got some backdoors that we're working. So we see these ridiculous Turkish delegations coming here, talking about bilateral trade, or how we're going to sort of, work the problem. And I'm saying, who do you speak for? What is your institutional backing, other than, checking boxes that Mr. Erdogan wants to see on a media event? So I think what's really missing from either the Syria front, which I hope I'll leave to you, obviously, is how do you formulate anything with the absence of significant institutional input and devices?
I really appreciate your focus on, domestic politics, but also Erdogan particularly and his decision-making. I think there have been a number of incidents, and again, going back to domestic politics, looking at calling for the nullification of the first Istanbul election and then pushing for a rerun, that are leading a lot of people to sort of question his decision-making. And given how much influence he has, as you say, I think this is a really important question. I think it was maybe you, Alan, at a panel that we were on, I think you said he sort of lost his golden touch. In the sense that he seems to be making mistakes. Mm-hmm. So one of the things, and Gönül, I want to direct this question to you because you've written so much on Syria. He's had to kind of flip policies on the Syrians a couple times, right? Initially, it is, our borders are open. These are Sunni Muslims who are fleeing persecution. He talks about giving them citizenship and so forth. And then, he's seeing polling that's telling him that even his pious followers are not happy about this, and we're starting to see deportations, and then he's getting blowback from that. Has he just bungled this, or is his call to let's put 1 million of the Syrians in this safe zone, irrespective of 70% of them come from Aleppo? Like, what's going on with that?
Well, I think Turkey's policy shift in Syria, I think the recent summit that was held in Ankara with Russian president and Iranian president summed it up for me. So here you have Erdogan, he sat back and enjoyed the treats as Iranian president told the world that efforts to topple the regime have failed. Mm-hmm. And Erdogan just sat there, and he was the host of this meeting. So this just tells you how far...
And one of the main backers of trying to topple the regime.
How far Turkey has shifted its Syria policy. So I've always argued that you have to see Turkey's reaction to the war in Syria is against the background of Erdogan's efforts at home to consolidate his power. So you see these various shifts. So starting when the conflict started in Syria in 2011, Turkey's #1 priority was toppling the regime. Because by the time the conflict started there, he had already consolidated power, and there was this dialectical relationship. He wanted to Islamize because he could afford to pursue an ideological policy both at home and abroad, because he had consolidated power in his own hands. So he was comfortable in 2011, and the Arab uprisings gave him an opening to use that. So. That's why when the conflict started there, he pursued this very Islamist agenda, and his #1 priority was toppling of an Alawi regime. So that was his #1 priority. But then his efforts to consolidate his power hit a wall at home, starting from 2015. And that was when, with the rise of the pro-Kurdish party, he lost his parliamentary majority in 2015. And that's when he realized that this is not going to work for him. And that's when we saw the ceasefire between the PKK and Turkey broke down. Mm-hmm. And that's when he struck this alliance with the country's nationalists. And that's when he decided to pursue a very heavy-handed militaristic approach vis-a-vis the Kurdish problem. And that had huge implications for his Syria policy, because that's when he decided, and I have to mention, by that time, the U.S. had started working closely with the YPG, and that also had an impact. But primarily it was his domestic politics and domestic Kurdish politics that changed his strategy again in 2015. And that time, the Syrian Kurdish militia, the PYD, became the number one threat. And toppling the regime came after that. So we are now seeing another shift. In the Ankara summit, he spoke at length about the need to create a safe zone. He has been pushing for that since 2011. But when he spoke about a safe zone in 2011, he wanted to establish a safe zone so that he could place the Syrian opposition, political opposition, in that zone. And when he talked about establishing a safe zone starting from 2015, he wanted to do that in an effort to prevent the establishment of a continuous Kurdish autonomous region. So now he's talking about creating a safe zone to send back millions of Syrian refugees. Why? Because another election just shook up his rule. And a top reason for that was the presence of 3.6 million Syrian refugees. So he now feels electorally vulnerable, mainly because of that, along with the state of Turkish economy. So now his strategy shifted. So now his number one priority is to send back the Syrian refugees. And number two, curbing the Kurdish influence. And I don't think toppling the regime is even on the list now. So that's why when you look at Erdogan's strategy in Syria, you really have to look at what his efforts to consolidate his own power at home. And I think right now his hands are tied in Syria. Because he boxed himself in this alliance with the nationalists and he has nowhere else to turn. And second, his hands are tied in Syria because he's at the mercy of Russia. Whatever Turkey has done in Syria, it all happened after a green light from Russia. And Russia, until now, Turkey managed to, it was like Turkey played its relationship with US and Russia against each other. So, but now we're coming to a point where none of these countries, neither the United States nor Russia, is willing to give what Turkey wants, which is a deep safe zone, deep enough to host 2 to 3 million refugees. That's not going to happen. Russians are not going to allow that. And Americans are not willing to do that, because if they do that, that will undercut their whole Syria strategy.
Alan, on the refugee issue, so you and your team at Center for American Progress have done a lot of surveys on Syrians in Turkey, on public attitudes towards that. And speaking of tensions with the West, obviously we see that, Europe is deeply imbricated in this, and we see, occasional comments that Erdogan is making, like the buses are ready, we'll open the gates, we'll send the Syrians there. You have the EU-Turkey refugee deal in 2016. He calls Germans Nazis and fascists when they don't allow his party to campaign there. And then in September 2018, the red carpet is rolled out for his visit, and there's an impending attack on Idlib. And so we can put the timing together. So when you're sort of seeing him make comments like, we're going to open the gates and so forth, I mean, do you think he has a lot of leverage with Europe? Do you agree that the Syrian refugee issue is a really big pressure point for him?
Look, I think I'm not a Europe expert. But just observing Europe's behavior vis-a-vis Turkey compared with what it had been, yeah, I think the Europeans are really intimidated by it. Now, if you're the man from Mars just looking at it objectively from a distance, I think you might say, well, the Europeans don't have that much to be worried about, because after all, the word is gotten around among the refugees that they're not going to make it to Germany. Even if they get across, they're going to be stuck in Greece, which is not where they want to go. And most of them would rather be in Turkey, even if they only have, questionable legal status. Most of them have legitimate legal status, but they'd rather be in Turkey than in a camp in Greece. But it is true that in recent weeks, the numbers have picked up, not to what they were before 2016, but they've picked up. And yes, I think it makes Europe reticent about dealing with Turkey on issues like human rights, And even, I would say, although this remains to be seen, on Turkey's drilling in the Eastern Mediterranean, partly in an economic exclusion zone, which is a legal concept about areas where countries can claim beyond their territorial waters where they can mine mineral, benefit from the resources of the sea. The Turks are drilling in an area of the sea that's claimed by Cyprus, which is an EU member. And the EU sort of made a certain statement. There was a very light sanction, which was close to meaningless. The EU has the economic power that they could really make it very difficult for Turkey. Over half of Turkey's trade goes to the EU, and something like, at least last I checked, 2/3 of foreign direct investment in Turkey comes from the EU. And Turkey's part of the customs union with the EU. But the EU has been very hesitant, and I think, yes, I think it does intimidate them when Erdogan says, I'll throw the doors open.
I think he sold that horse 3 or 4 times to the Europeans, because they've, since 2011, repeatedly, whenever he makes that threat, the Europeans shut up about criticizing domestic developments in Turkey, and they find more EU assistance to provide Turkey in order to keep him from doing this. And so the reason he keeps doing it is it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you agree with me that it's still working?
Yeah.
One thing I did want to say on that, if I could, one thing of the statements of his that you cited, besides throwing the doors open, he frequently says that the EU has not been paying the money. That the basic deal that he made in 2016 was the EU was going to give 6 billion euros of support for the refugees, and Turkey would restrain the refugees or make sure that they don't go across the Aegean into EU territory. As far as I can tell, and I did a paper on this recently where I looked at it carefully, the EU is fully living up to its obligations. The one thing that it does, which the U.S. also does with foreign aid, is they have implementing partners. It takes time to vet organizations. There are bids on the various projects, but they are fully living up to it. And they finished the first tranche of $3 billion, and I believe about 50% of the next tranche is at least, if not allocated, at least, if not appropriated, is at least they've designated where it's going.
I appreciate your comments and Eric's comments on this. We're sort of seeing Erdogan take what seems like a harsher, more aggressive stance to Syrians now, but it's worth kind of looking at the tactical way in which they've been sort of leveraging the Syrians with the EU for quite a bit. Before I turn it over to the audience for questions, because I'm sure there's a lot to talk about, Sinan, I want to ask you about the Turkish opposition, because we've been talking a lot about domestic politics and the role that Erdogan's authoritarian consolidation plays in some of these in terms of whipping up the nationalist vote, as Gönül was talking about. But you've literally written the book on the Turkish opposition. And the Republican, you have a book called The Republican People's Party, Secularism and Kemalism, and it's a fantastic book. So you've been writing a lot about the Turkish opposition. So I wanted to get your take on, so İmamoğlu has been able to win the Istanbul election, right? And it looks as though his position may not be threatened. A couple of weeks ago, there was the removal of Kurdish mayors, for example, 3 Kurdish mayors, and it looked as though perhaps the interior minister was looking at removing İmamoğlu as well. Is he sort of the sign of the future? Has the Turkish opposition figured out how to challenge Erdogan? Is there a chance, if elections matter, of course, which is a big if, right, because we've been seeing the move towards authoritarianism. How would you sort of assess the Turkish opposition at this point?
Thank you for your generous remarks. It's a dated book, but the way I look at this is, I got it wrong. I'm one of those people, the pessimists as Rushan would refer to us, suggesting that no matter what happens, Erdogan would not permit the Istanbul and Ankara mayoralties, whoever, despite the popular vote, he would find a way of essentially
You were not alone in that.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
the
we
jury might
were all
still be out on
pessimists.
that.
We don't know yet.
I think the jury's still out.
The jury might still be out on that. But, let me also preface this by saying, paying somewhat of respect to what's going on in Turkey outside of the Istanbul-Ankara circle, which is probably a little bit more concerning. And it was only highlighted by the sort of removal of the three big mayors in the southeast, the Kurdish provinces, right, of Diyarbakir, Van, and Mardin. But hundreds of local mayors in those provinces were also removed subsequent to the election, having just been elected or re-elected in a lot of cases. I mean, to just say that procedural democracy in Turkey had been curtailed Russian-esque, again, is another comparison that I'm not accustomed to seeing in Turkey, but also is reflective of Erdogan's paranoia, because no matter what Turkey is, he still worries and probably stays up at night at what popular discontent can do to people. He's witnessed the Arab uprisings, he's witnessed the color revolutions, he's seen how Gaddafi's come to an end, he's seen how Saddam Hussein's come to an end. There are probably more palatable ways to be taken down from power, but all this creates a lot of stress for him, I imagine, because he's also being challenged in a way that's not necessarily changeable, right? These local mayors being elected in not only the southeastern Kurdish provinces, but also the more sort of industrial western cities such as Istanbul, Ankara, but not to mention half a dozen other sort of big industrial centers. And it's a reminder to him of how change happens in Turkey, because that's the route that he followed to essentially convince his bona fides and his capabilities through local governance, spoils networks, distribution networks that allowed him to establish his base of power, and economic cronyism that essentially allowed him to build a political base as well as a popular base that got him elected, right? And now he's having to give all these up, inch by inch, and those are worries for him. Just a couple of weeks ago, if it's not that long ago now, the newly re-elected mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, he put on display several hundred vehicles that belong to the city of Istanbul, right? Now, I thought that was quite genius because, you can do one of two things to discredit the national leader, which is Erdogan, right? You can sort of call him out to be a political corrupt person. He persecuted him. We've seen this play out in Turkey since 2013, right? It's gotten nowhere. But we have economic stagnation in Turkey. People are finding it difficult to pay their bills. They're finding it difficult to actually buy basic foodstuffs. And just in case you're interested, a kilo of sweet potatoes in Istanbul costs 44 lira, which is about $10 US dollars. And so people are kind of thinking, this is, kind of strange. By displaying vehicles that clearly have been utilized by city officials to an unprecedented degree for personal use, even sort of minor positions have had 3 vehicles, these people are bearing witness to excessive waste. And it's really hard to change the mind of a person, no matter how much of a diehard Erdogan they've been up till now, to look at these vehicles on their way to work or on a weekend outing to just see what kind of vehicles there are. And if you don't know what 1,300 vehicles looks like, it's a lot. And these separated them by luxury vehicles and ordinary vehicles, and this started gaining traction. I mean, if I was a guy who's finding it difficult to feed my baby, and I'm an Erdogan supporter, that's hard to argue with. Symbols matter. Yeah. So I think overall, Erdogan's in a position of thinking, if he escalates this, the next chapter is, let's open up the city books. Let's see who's been paid for nothing. And I'll give you one example and then I'll shut up, because I think this is what keeps up at night. In some cases, imagine this, city officials have purchased vehicles from a dealer. They are renting these back to the city of Istanbul or Ankara, renting them back, charging the city rent for these cars, because they're going to work with them as commuting vehicles, getting the city to pay the gas, the insurance, and the depreciation on these vehicles. I cannot imagine how this would play out in Washington, D.C. City officials renting their personal vehicles back to the city. If it seems farcical to you and it's kind of in the wheelhouse of what could happen in Turkey, I can assure you it's not. It is highly unusual. We've had corruption in Turkey, but it's unprecedented. So what I would say is, if he keeps on, if the sort of the mayors, the elected mayors, keep on pushing the buck like this in terms of say, forget calling him a despot, a tyrant, or undemocratic, forget all of that. Put on display vehicles, houses, wanton waste, and put that on camera, and continuously expose this in a methodical campaign. Then you got your money on Erdogan's weakness, because it's really hard to argue with physical evidence.
Yeah. So why are you pessimistic, Sinan?
Because he could be removed. I mean, that's the other thing. I'm not going to play to Rushan's playbook, but again, what if he removes Imamoglu? I mean, he's done it with the Kurdish mayors, and I know that's not the same thing.
It's
removal of Imamoglu would cause a rift, but it may not.
Well, his campaign manager.
Well, removing Kurds is I mean, sorry, Hishar, but no one really cares, right? I mean,
right. Yeah.
I'm telling you. I mean, even yes, the CHP has done good things, like Imamoglu went to Diyarbakir and all that stuff. I think it was not. It was far from enough, given what the Kurdish voters did to the CHP right before the election. Basically, the HDP voters handed the CHP their victory.
Yeah.
And yet the CHP is still sitting on the fence. But I have to give credit to them. Now there's this new, who is that person? The CHP person recently released a book talking about the third way to the Kurdish question. So they are taking some steps in the right direction, but they're not there yet. So removing Imamoglu is a completely different thing. So I'm optimistic. It's a recently acquired optimism. It's 3 months old. It happened after June Istanbul rerun elections. But I am optimistic.
Oh my goodness. So I mean, this is, I think, the really interesting question of, has the CHP, as you've written about, and the identity red lines that have problematized it, have they figured out a formula for reaching out to the Kurds? Are they not going far enough? There was all this kerfuffle when Imamoglu's wife has, lunch with the wife of Selahattin Demirtas, who is in jail. It was her birthday, and that was maybe seen as, she shouldn't have been hanging out with them. But then, as Sinan, as you've written about, Imamoglu, points to the removal of these Kurdish mayors, not using the Kurdish angle, but rather this is anti-democratic. Yeah. So is that a way to kind of make these outreaches? So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch. I don't know. I feel like Imamoglu might go, but that could be a game changer. I don't know. We'll have to see.
I mean, they've already laid the predicate of criminal charges.
Exactly, for
against
Mansur
CHP
Yavaş. Yeah. I think a lot of us thought that maybe Mansur Yavaş and Ankara would go as well, right? So this, I think, is really interesting in terms of the incremental regime change that's happening and where it's happening. And I agree. I think Gönül makes a really important point. If you want to kind of watch where that was happening, it was happening in the southeast. And it's just that not a lot of people were paying attention to it in terms of the eradication of democracy.
It just won't create a public uproar if you remove EHD MPs from parliament, HDP mayors. Just people are just so used to it. Yeah.
But do you have any faith in Istanbulites rising up?
Is there another Gezi in the
Well,
works?
it was, no, actually, I mean, haven't you seen in March elections, what was the margin? It was less than 1%.
13,000, and then it went to 800,000.
Huge.
Exactly, huge, 10%. I mean, so that's a public uproar. That's just an uprise, I think. That's just people telling you, stop there.
No doubt. I have little faith in the rank and file people in the cities, and it's like, let's say he does the unimaginable. He removes Yavaş in Ankara or just Imamoglu in Istanbul. Then what? Is it a predicate for public discontent? I just don't. I don't know the answer. I don't have a strong view on this. I'm just betting, like, if he deploys law enforcement, if there is a minor uproar, they squash it. They use a lot. Then business as usual. That's another obstacle removed. I don't know.
It also could be that it's just we've talked about he's been engaging in this kind of erratic decision making already, so we don't know that he's going to make what seems like the rational choice in terms of how he games it, right? But it could just be seen as a step too far. That
exactly, and it's not. I mean, Turkey is still, it's not a full-blown autocracy, and Turkey is a large country that its economy is integrated. It doesn't have oil, so it still needs investment, and he still has to keep that facade of democracy. We all know that there's nothing in there, and yet he needs that. So I think that would be a step too far.
And it's Istanbul, after all, which is where foreign businessmen come. And I think you raised the key qualifier, Erdogan's erratic decision making. So we don't know, but I would be, and I think he'll find other ways to squeeze Istanbul and to squeeze Imamoglu than to actually kick him out of office. I think that would be a step too far. But I thought, I'm sorry, I just want to.
Go ahead.
I thought it might be interesting. I know we tend to think that people don't care what goes on in the Kurdish areas, but and of course it's not the highest priority in Western Turkey, but I do think there is I think there is a little bit of a sense of abuse of fair play that many Turks feel. Look, we saw what made the difference when Imamoglu jumped from a 13,000 margin to an 800,000 margin. People felt he got screwed. They felt that he was treated unfairly. I mean, a lot of people in AK Party, according to the polls, thought. Well, I'll just quote from a newer poll. There's a company Metro poll, which is one that my think tank subscribes to, and actually they've been pretty accurate in recent years. So, make of it what you will. A poll is just a snapshot. But they asked in their August survey how people viewed the replacement of the mayors in the three major Kurdish cities, in Van, Diyarbakir, and Mardin. 45%, well, more thought it was positive than negative. That's not a surprise. But the margin was very close. It was 45 to 40. And also, I found it very interesting, CHP, which, I mean, historically, right, has been a very nationalist party. Imamoglu got elected, frankly, because of his coalition, his informal coalition with the pro-Kurdish HDP. And he went out to Diyarbakir. He condemned the removal of the mayor of Diyarbakir. He's tried to move the party, 60%. 26 among those who voted for CHP, only 26% thought the removal of the mayors was positive. 60% thought it was negative. I think that's a real victory for.
Can I, Eric? Can I give you just the last
I'm
quick
sorry,
word on?
I know,
No, you're good. We need the statistics. That's fantastic.
So
last word on the opposition, and then we'll go to the audience.
Yes, because Sinan was talking about what keeps Erdogan up at night, and we've been focused on the electoral opposition. I think he has other nightmares because you mentioned the Arab Spring and what happened to Saddam Hussein, what happened to Gaddafi, what happened in Syria. One thing he talks about all the time is a little bit closer to home, which is what happened to Adnan Menderes. And I think since July 2016, we have tended to think, another coup is completely out of the question. I don't think he thinks that. And I think one reason why I think he proceeded with the S-400 sale is
100%.
precisely because it is a system that could be used to shoot down F-16s. And I think he is worried about that as much as he is about any external threat. And I think that tells you that, and I think we're very much now, in terms of what's going on inside the military, in a situation like the one in 1960, because the senior officer class has been thoroughly remade in sort of the AKP's image, but it's a very large military establishment, and what lurks beneath the surface at the 06 level, the colonel and below level, I don't think we know, and I think he's fearful of.
Absolutely. And kind of to tie this all together, not only that his belief that could happen, but that the U.S. is somehow involved in that or somehow related to that, right? So that's a great way of tying this together. So we have a microphone. If you're interested in asking a question, just go ahead, raise your hand. We'll get to you. I ask that you just state your name, your institutional affiliation, and make it a brief question, not a comment. Thank you very much. Yep, in the back there, Jessica.
Hello. My name is Nika. I work for IRI. I work on the Ukraine program. Thank you, first of all, for sharing so much good information and for the nice debate that you guys had up there yourselves. My question concerns Russian deployment of S-400s on Crimea and also just everything that is happening in the Sea of Azov and Crimea and Ukraine in general. What do do you guys think Turkey's perspective is on those developments?
Okay. Anyone want to take that on?
No.
Well,
option.
so, I mean, I would say this, which is that what's striking about all this is Turkey's silence in the face of Russian efforts to make the Black Sea essentially a Mare Nostrum for Russia. I mean, Turkey, traditionally, because of the Montreux Convention, has controlled access to the Black Sea, regarded access as extremely important, cared about Black Sea issues, but I think they've been so preoccupied by Syria and domestic political, issues, and are so constrained by being beholden to Russia for other reasons that they've turned a blind eye to something that in the past would have been a major source of concern in Ankara.
Yeah, and Erdogan has to tread very carefully there, and we've seen that in 2008 Georgian war, where Turkey basically was put in a very tough spot. On the one hand, you have the American ships in the Black Sea, and on the other, Russians are asking them to leave. So Turkey really, Erdogan felt that it could not afford to alienate Russia.
Erdogan also stalled, delayed the ships getting into the Black Sea.
Exactly. So with on Crimea, every now and then they talk about how Crimea is important, and that Turkey cannot really allow the Russian invasion and all that, and also Turkey is developing this close defense ties with Ukraine. But I think it's just talk. I mean, again, Eric just mentioned that there's just too much going on in Turkey-Russia partnership, and I think Turkey has become the junior partner in that relationship. Turkey depends very much on Russia than the other way around. In Syria, in energy, and now with the defense partnership. So Turkey is now basically at the mercy of Putin.
But
so
Erdogan did get a free ice cream cone from Putin.
Oh yes, and that was delicious. I heard.
Well, I think that that gets to the economic aspect of it too, right? And the fact that Turkey has this looming economic crisis. Turkey in the past would have been very outspoken about the Tatars, the Muslim Turkic community, especially because it's partially partnering with the Nationalist Action Party. But it's also silent on Uyghurs in China, right? So the economic dimension is huge here.
Formally, Turkey condemned the Russian annexation.
Yep.
Right.
But I remember that they did not join the EU sanctions on Russia, and I remember
Very
at the time one of their ministers said, "Oh, the EU sanctions, that's a great opportunity for us."
Yeah.
And I think that kind of sums up the attitude. It's the economics are much more important than the politics of it.
Very much
Crimean
so.
Tatars notwithstanding.
All right, next question. Gentleman in the back over there.
Hello, Alex Guerrero from the U.S. Department of Energy. My question regards the future of the F-35 program. We have invested a lot of our capital in developing this program. It is one of the most advanced fighter jets currently in existence, and Turkey has already played a very large role in its research and development. Can Turkey potentially use the transfer of sensitive technology as a bargaining chip for getting out of this political crisis in a way? Since now we're seeing a technology Cold War come up with China, do you think Turkey can somehow use some of the technology it has after experience with this project? Also, what does the future of the U.S. Air Force Base in Turkey, how will that play out? Because we still do have a lot of military interests in Turkey.
Okay. Any takers on that one? Alan, want to give it a shot?
I can take F-35. You want to take intro?
Yeah, you take F-35.
All right. I mean, so
Are we a friendly panel?
This crisis has been building for a very long time, and both the Department of Defense and Lockheed Martin, which is the manufacturer of the F-35, have been planning to unwind Turkey's participation in the event that this happened for a while. And so there will be some dislocation in the program, but it is not as great as it would have been had this happened, say, a year ago or earlier than that. I don't think that there's anything particularly sensitive that Turkey has been involved in manufacturing that would, be a point of blackmail for them. So I just don't think. I think this is going to be. It's going to be a bump in the production schedule of the program, and it's going to impose a bit of a cost, on the program. But it's not, not a huge blow, and I think is very manageable.
And this is a bigger blow to Turkish defense industry than it is to the U.S. defense industry, because Turkey has been using the F-35 program to build its indigenous fighter jet for some. That's been Turkey's deal for a long time, actually. That's what Turkey has always wanted. And that was one of the reasons, one of the drivers why Turkey wanted to be part of that F-35 program. So now that Turkey is out, it's really going to hurt domestic efforts to build its own fighter jet. And if further CATSA sanctions follow, that could even impact the F-16s that Turkey
and
has.
there's an ongoing
Sure.
impact, because it wasn't just the manufacturer, it was also depot maintenance of the aircraft stretching out into the future, that was a part of which was going to take place in Turkey.
Which I think bolsters, Eric, your argument that the reason for buying the S-400 was probably had more to do with Erdogan's sense of personal vulnerability than any sort of strategic thinking. I mean, from a strategic point of view, it makes absolutely no sense that you would rather have two S-400 anti-air systems, anti-missile systems, than to have 100 F-35s and be able to participate in this program, which would further your internal production. By the way, Turkey's military production really has emerged over the years, and Turkey is now, I don't know, so it depends on the year, but somewhere between 15th and 20th in terms of exporting military equipment. This is a fulfillment of a long dream. I mean, the big lesson that Turks took from the arms embargo after the 74 Cyprus invasion, or intervention, as the Turks say, was the arms embargo happened 1975 to 78, and they said, we can't let this happen again. We have to start develop an indigenous industry. And since then, when they bought major arms systems, there was always an emphasis on co-production, starting with the F-16s in 1983. So, I mean, Erdogan has taken a giant step away from Turkish strategy in choosing these S-400s over
Actually,
the
it
F-35.
goes further back, Alan. I think it was in the 1930s where there was this campaign, Build Your Own Plane campaign. So it's been a long time dream of...
Well, you're a lot older than I am, so it's a fair
highlight.
Did you want to touch on Incirlik really quickly?
Incirlik.
The Incirlik. So, look, first of all, terminology. They're not U.S. based. It's not a U.S. base. It's a Turkish
Correct.
base. They're all Turkish facilities. This was a very sore point a few decades
At which
ago.
we have a rotational presence.
Yeah, right, in which we have a
Continuously
rotational
since
presence.
1956.
We are there, and if anyone who has worked on that base, as I have, you're constantly reminded that it is not a U.S. base. I once accidentally left the base without my ID. And even though I was the only American civilian working on the base, everybody knew who I was. It took 6 hours before I was able to get back in. So that was just one of the ways they constantly remind Americans that it is indeed a Turkish base. Look, I think what people have valued, what the U.S. has valued Turkey for over the years is its location. And first it was because of the Cold War bordering the Soviet Union, and then after the Cold War, I mean, it was Richard Holbrooke who said Turkey is at the center of every issue of importance to the United States on the Eurasian continent. And that has basically been the organizing principle, that we don't know exactly what's going to come up in the Turkish neighborhood, but we know Turkey, it's going to be key to use Turkey as a base to operate from. Okay, if Turkey strays too far into Russian into the Russian orbit, for example, buying fighter jets from Russia, yeah, I think we would have to leave Incirlik. I know there are people. It's been a major point of discussion in the think tank community. Could Incirlik be replaced? By the way, there's other facilities we use there, not only Incirlik, but Incirlik is the prominent one. And it's probably possible. There are places in Eastern Europe. I think some people talk about, using the KRG, or maybe even Cyprus, but I think that's a stretch. But I think if you ask most people at the Pentagon, and actually I wonder if you agree, most people would say that Incirlik is still highly valuable to the U.S. strategically.
I agree with that. That's right. But there are alternatives.
Yes.
And one of the really interesting elements here is certainly from 1967 on, or 1974 on, our relations with Turkey got increasingly better while our relations with Greece got increasingly worse. And today, really, the new Greek government's talking about enhancing, the U.S. military presence in Greece. There is a very live alternative.
That's right.
Because
In
we
Crete
have NATO.
especially, right?
There are NATO facilities already in Greece, and I think there is a danger that Turkey will see this as something that is more important to us than it is to them. And in the end of the day, I think, people may decide that, the juice isn't worth the squeeze here anymore, and we can make up for this in Qatar, in UAE, and in Greece, and not have all the headaches with Turkey.
I want to see if we can just take a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up, and you can each make your final remarks. So let's try and collect a couple of questions. Okay, so Jessica, if you want to come down here, we'll take 1, 2, and then David in the back, and then this gentleman right here.
It is Alperen from Turkey, and I am a SAIS MA student, first year. I was wondering what are the clashes of interests of US and Turkey in Syria? Because for me, US's interests are not really I cannot imagine there are some real US interests in Syria. And also I have a second question. This is for Professor Ciddi. Who eats sweet potatoes in Turkey?
Okay. Fair point. Nice, easy. That should be an easy one to answer. Okay, Jessica, if we want to take a couple back here, yeah. This gentleman right here.
We eat all the time. Nice.
Thank you.
Patlıcan oluyor.
Kadri Taştan, I'm with the GMF in Brussels. My question will be, I would like to hear your comments on this tension with Iran, how it can affect the U.S.-Turkey relations. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, Iran, and then we'll go to David. Yeah.
I'm David Wheel with the Department of Commerce. You've been mostly discussing the structural issues pushing Turkey away from the United States. I'd like to ask you to speculate perhaps on the possibility of a post-Erdogan or post-anti-American slide normalization. Is that possible? Are there clear red lines that you see after which such a thing would be not necessarily impossible, but much less likely? I think a lot of Americans also don't see the deep anti-Americanism that exists outside of Erdogan's own person. So.
Okay. And just so is there a woman who wants to ask a question? Because I didn't see a single. Okay, we've got one. All right. Yes.
Hi, my name is Rajan. I'm a SAIS BMA student. Can you hear me? Okay. My question is more related to domestic politics. There's a lot of talk about Davutoğlu and the AKP bloc creating their own new party. How do you see that affecting Turkey's foreign relations with the West?
Okay, excellent. So we've got anti-Americanism and potential post-Erdogan relations. We've got relations with Iran. How does that play into this mix? Excellent question. All of this together, U.S. interest in Syria, and then Babacan and Davutoglu and all the
Sweet
former...
potatoes.
And sweet potatoes, yes, we can't forget.
You take that one.
Yeah, that's yours.
All right.
Go away and think about it. Clearly.
Okay, I can take the question about the clash of interest, Turkish and U.S. interest in Syria. Well, I think it's really difficult to understand what U.S. policy in Syria is, but I think there are two clear, the priority there for the United States is preventing an ISIS comeback. I think that's number one priority. And if you want to do that, you really need to have a presence there. And the second aim, I think, is to curb Iranian influence. That's, to me, it is a lot more vague goal, but it's there. So these are two American interests. And so from the American point of view, if you want to keep fighting against the Islamic State, you have to work with your partners on the ground. And the Kurdish militia, the YPG, is the only partner that the U.S. has on the ground. And of course, that's a problem for Turkey. And from the Turkish perspective, it's not just YPG is very problematic. As I said before, I think now Erdogan's number one priority is to address the Syrian refugee issue. And he thinks that a safe zone in northern Syria, along the Turkish border, which is as deep as 30 kilometers, would solve his problem. That's what he thinks. And Americans, they've always pushed back on this idea of establishing a safe zone for various reasons. But I think at this point, having a safe zone that's as deep as 30 kilometers, which would be off limits to the YPG, would really undermine U.S. strategy, because that means if you push the YPG out of that zone, who is going to fight against the Islamic State? How many U.S. troops do we have? Like less than 2,000, I believe, in Syria.
Yeah.
So you can't really fight an effective war with that many troops on the ground. So they really need the YPG. So that's now, I think, the gist of the problem is how wide that safe zone is going to be. But I think the deeper question is the threat perception. I mean, obviously Turks are considering the YPG as a threat, and the Americans are working with them. And in terms of curbing Iranian power, I think from the U.S. perspective, by being physically there and controlling that area in northeastern Syria, in a way fulfills that goal, because then you really deny that region to the Iranians. Now the question becomes, what happens? Trump has been talking about withdrawing from Syria. What happens then? We don't know whether that's going to happen or when that's going to happen. But until now, Turkey is in no way to curb Iranian influence, not in Syria, not in the region. And I know Americans have been talking about that for a long time. They always want to, those who are saying, well, let's not really alienate Turkey here because we're going to need the Turks for our Iran strategy in the region. We could use that as a counterbalance. I think that's not a realistic policy. Turkey is dependent on Iran. It has to work with Iran, and it will never... It has what Turkey can do in terms of countering Iran has serious limits. There is no political will or capability to counter Iranian influence in the region.
Gentlemen, I'm going to give you each about 2 minutes. So, Alan, which of the questions you want to take on?
You know what I'm going to do, if you don't mind, Madam Chairman, I'm going to punt on all those questions, and because I wanted to close with something that I just want to share what my current biggest concern about Turkey is, if that's okay. And it's
Absolutely.
really underscoring something Eric said and building on that. Eric, you mentioned the fact that we don't really know what the Turkish military is. I just want to underscore that point. Before the last coup attempt, I would say most people thought that the Turkish military was the last bastion of secularism, Kemalist secularism. There is virtually nobody who thought there was Gulenist influence in the military. And
We
while
knew it in
it's-
the police and the judiciary, but
yeah,
not
police,
not the extent.
judiciary, education department even, but ministry, but not the military. We don't know. My big concern is this. Erdogan is growing increasingly unpopular, it seems to me. I think that's backed up by the polls and other information, including some of your recent articles, Lisel. The economy is in a tailspin, but there is no way to get to new elections till 2023. No obvious way. The only way, there's a new system in place in Turkey that was voted on in 2017 that makes it very difficult to have early elections unless you need to get, I'll spare you some of the complications, but basically you need 60% of parliament to get to new elections. Erdogan has about 48% of parliament just in his own party, never mind his coalition partner. He would need to lose. There would have to be a defection of about 50 of his 290 plus members of parliament in order to get to, and have every other party vote for new elections as well in order to get to new elections. I think we're in a very difficult stalemate, and I'm afraid that it's a formula for extra legal action. And so I'm really not in that camp that dismisses the possibility of another coup in Turkey. It's not something I'm predicting or betting the mortgage on. No one should ever do that with something like a coup, but it's certainly, given Turkey's history, something that cannot be dismissed in the current circumstance. So.
Excellent. Thank you. Eric, briefly, do you want to take on Iran or?
Well, let me try and just very briefly hit on all these things. I mean, I think to the degree that U.S.-Iran tensions are heightened in the period ahead, it's not going to be good for U.S.-Turkish relations for all the reasons Gönül said. And it's going to remind people of Halk Bank and the sanctions evasion and everything. Is going to bring that back to the fore, so it can't be good for the relationship. In terms of, I have nothing to add to what Gönül said about U.S. interest in Syria. I think she hit it right on the head. On the question of post-Erdogan, U.S.-Turkish relations and the potential, this is not going to snap back even if Erdogan departs the scene. I think one thing that people don't appreciate is the degree to which the media, which has been now thoroughly controlled for the most part by Erdogan and his cronies, has injected just an incredibly toxic blend of anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, rampant nationalism into the body politic, and that's not going to go away quickly, and it's not going to be healed easily. And it's not clear to me what happens once he leaves the scene. It's not clear whether there's anybody else in the AKP who can manage this personalistic, crony capitalist system that he's created. So I think it's just impossible to tell what will happen. But I would say anybody who thinks it's just going to snap back to the status quo ante of what it was in the 1990s is dreaming. It's not going to be that at all. On Minister Babacan and Minister Davutoglu and whether President Gül also gets into this or not, I'm going to defer.
After the helicopter in his courtyard?
I'm going to defer to Sinan on that, but I would just say this. One of the things Turkey has to have, if it's going to get out of this kind of electoral authoritarian regime that Erdogan has created, is an effective opposition that people in Turkey can conceive of as potentially an alternative source of governance for the country to the AKP. And they haven't had that since 2001. And so if Babacan and Gül and Davutoglu, whoever else, can help create something that appears to be that will be a huge boon for Turkey and Turkish citizens and Turkish democracy.
Okay. Sinan, the last word is yours.
Very quickly, whoops, this is falling apart. My biggest concern about the post-Erdogan era is, if we'd spoken about this pre-transition to a hyper-presidential system in Turkey, I could have given you a chart of transition of power if something happens to somebody, if the prime minister falls ill or is incapacitated. I'm not actually clear in the line of succession. What if the president is incapacitated or passes away in Turkey in this present system? Who takes over? I don't actually know for clear. It doesn't seem that apparent to me. It's kind of murky. I'm sure there's some.
Is not the vice president? I mean, they created as vice president.
Although they
There's a
theoretically
couple,
could have
though.
multiple vice
Yeah.
presidents, but
So-
I think there's a provision that within 90 days or something.
Okay, so who governs for that time?
Why? It's a good question.
I think it's really
Remaining for the
unstated.
next
It's
panel,
untested.
yes.
It is
Yeah,
untested, and
I
I really
think-
worry about that
yeah.
because in terms of like actual control of the country, in terms of then it comes to your notion about the military and who's in power. I'm not sure that's set in stone, and I've looked
I'm
at the
not sure
constitution,
either.
and
Yeah.
it's not that clear.
Yeah.
Quickly on Iran, I would say you can take this in many ways, and I appreciate my friend's take on this. Turkey's actually, it was annoyed at the re-establishment of Iranian sanctions, not least of all because it was getting a reasonable, supply of alternative gas and petrochemicals from Iran for its own domestic needs. But it's also on another level worried about Iranian influence, its expansion. But bottom line is, I don't think Turkey is in any position to do anything about it because it has no capacity. Its best chances of actually, keeping Iran at bay, whether it's in Syria or regional dominant aspirations, would be to work with the United States. But I guess that's now out the window, given that they were tasting figs in Ankara with Putin and Rouhani. So on the last point, Davutoglu, and I'm just going to touch upon Davutoglu because,
I knew you would.
You love him.
yeah, I really like him.
They're like this.
So I think he's electorally inconsequential. Out of the threats posed to Erdogan, out of the Babacan and Gül sort of camp versus, he's the least influential because he is playing entirely for the AKP camp of voters, but also trying to take people away from the AKP itself within the AKP, which I don't think is going to go anywhere because I don't think he has electoral appeal, or I don't think people are going to be willing to follow his lead. But more than that, Erdogan could still worry because let's say even if he got half a percentage point, which is not very much, but Erdogan's already on the rails looking for any way to maintain his electoral base. Well, 1% decline in anything is again a hit. So I guess he worries about Davutoglu's potential in that sense rather than seeing him as a successor or a replacement, because I don't think Davutoglu has that in himself. He's not that much of a big threat. So that's where I was.
Sweet potatoes? No.
That's a really important thing. Now, you have to understand, my mom, she really likes
She does, actually. They're amazing. All right, thank you so much for indulging us in time. My friends, and I mean my friends, the knowledge at this table is vast. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights. Please join me in thanking them.
Thank you.
I'll be part of this panel anytime.